Morning, everybody. Crappy Mondays. And welcome to the news agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined by the Mirror's political editor, John Stevens. Morning, John.
Hey, morning, Susie.
Now, this is the People's Paper Review. Don't forget, so get into the comments, ask us your questions. We'll do our best to answer them for you. Those of you listening later on podcast will just have to wait for Nigel Farage to come along and kneecap your opponents. So what have we got for you today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on pubs that are struggling for survival in the cost of living crisis as they're forced to call time at 8 o'clock in some cases to save on wages and heating. There's plenty about that in today's paper if you want to look it up, but I want to take us to page 2, where the nation has been given a lesson in Tory economics and how this works. So, John, if I've got this right, we've had a row for a couple of weeks now since the budget about the Tories wanting to scrap national insurance, which Labour would have us believe will cost £46 billion and mean an end to the state pension. Disaster. Yet here we are on Sunday morning political shows, and the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt has said, no. Not only will there still be pensions, but we're also going to protect them with the triple lock, which means they're guaranteed to get more expensive every single year by the same amount as whether 2.5% average wages or inflation, depending whichever is higher. Now, how can he actually my maths is not great, but how can he commit to spending more money on what is already the biggest state benefit while scrapping the only means we've actually got to pay for it?
Well, I don't think this is really about economics. It's more about politics, Susie. And we know that the group of people who are most likely to go out and vote are people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, people who receive the state pension. And so the political parties have clearly they're both going to have it in their manifesto. I would bet my whole pension pot, which is maybe not loads of money.
Both peanuts.
I would bet my whole pension pot on both of the parties putting it in their manifesto. And the reason is they just know that it is very popular with voters. And there are a lot of people in the country who rely on this. And I mean, the argument that Jeremy Hunt made yesterday, which different people have made before, is when prices increase in shops, when inflation goes up, people who are working do sometimes have the ability to work some more hours to be able to kind of make up that increase. I mean, I think we're all slightly limited. That's a very theoretical idea, but they would say that pensioners, they've got a limited pot of money. They have no way to increase that money. And so therefore they would argue it's fairer to give them this sort of increase. But obviously it is going to cost loads and loads of money. But it is something that the political parties have promised before. And as much as they've wobbled over it, and Jeremy Hunt suggested last week that it may not be sustainable in the long term, I think they probably saw the backlash from pensioners coming very quickly and decided that that wasn't a very good idea.
Yeah. I mean, what do you think, everybody? Do you think that the pensions triple lock is vital? Is it how you manage to make sure that every year you can just about try and keep up with the increases in the cost of living and council tax and God knows what? I mean, 2.5% or whatever doesn't go very far if your council tax has just gone up 6%. You know, it doesn't. Usually there are people sort of struggling even with the triple lock. But if you're younger and you're paying your taxes, there are fewer of us paying taxes for more of them. And they're a low wage economy that it's not really sustainable. Now, this was a policy that was first imposed upon us by David Cameron, and every government since has stuck to it pretty much for the same reason that you were just talking about, John. It's all Tory governments since then, and pensioners are more likely to vote Tory, and they're more likely to vote, full stop. And it's this simple sort of electoral maths that's the reason that they've done it. But, you know, the latest polls are showing that older members of the population are heading towards Labour. And they're now less likely to vote Tory and more likely to vote for Keir Starmer. But that's sort of stymied any chance of a reform, hasn't it? Because Labour are now having to say they'll keep that triple lock as well. And they've got exactly the same electoral reasons for doing it. So it almost looks like this is never going to change.
Yeah, I struggle to see how you would be able to get rid of it unless there's some sort of event that happens. Maybe you had some sort of financial crash again and you had to start talking about taking drastic measures. But I just don't see at the moment the reality of either the parties getting rid of it. And it's not just pensioners on the Tory side, it's pensioners on all sides seem to really value it and think it's really important. last week when we had Keir Starmer coming into Mirror HQ to answer questions for Mirror readers, the top question that came in from readers, and it was coming in from dozens of people, was saying, will Keir Starmer commit to keeping the triple lock? Because a lot of pensioners, as much as the younger generation might say, oh yeah, well, people who are retired have got loads of money sloshing around. There might be some pensioners who are pretty well off and you've got pretty nice pension deals that are nothing like the pensions you'd be able to get if you were working now. However, there are a lot of pensioners who are struggling to get by, who are very limited in what money they've got. And when the prices go up in shops, just like the rest of us, they find it rather difficult to pay for them.
Exactly, and it's pretty problematic, isn't it? So there are fewer workers. We've got paying high taxes. We've got increasing the state pension that goes to more and more people because we've got this demographic bubble, haven't we? Where there's more pensioners and fewer people paying into it. And even though pensioners say, we pay into pensions and national insurance all our lives, it's just what we're owed. That money got spent, lads, ages ago, right? The only thing that is paying for it now is people who are currently paying into the system. So, if the case for reform economically is really obvious, isn't it? Because they're right in saying this just isn't sustainable. You can't keep paying this, getting bigger and bigger every year, no matter what. And it does seem like with NHS and health developments and so on that we are going to get more and more pensioners. We all get the luxury of getting old, and we don't all have private pensions and don't get the gold-plated ones they get there when they're sitting in Parliament for a few years. So is there ever going to be a case, you think, for ending the triple lock? As any government, because at some point in the future, they're going to find that the maths just is no longer adding up, surely.
Yeah, I think there's possibility some point down the line that something happens, but parties aren't particularly brave in this area because of the kind of electoral maths. And you look at, we've had conversations in the last few months about, is the state pension age at the right level? It's meant to increase, I can't remember the dates, I think it's meant to increase, I shouldn't have started this because now I know I can't remember the figures at all. It's meant to increase. What is it at the moment? Is it 68?
65. The WASPy women thing I remember seeing, it went to 65 for everybody.
It's 65 for everyone. And it's meant to go up to 68 at some point. And they were talking, the government were talking last year, do we bring forward when it goes up? I can't remember, 68 or 70. It's meant to be in like the 2040s. And they were saying maybe bring it forward to the 2030s. And surprise, surprise, with an election on the horizon, ministers just thought, we do not want to touch this. We don't want to go anywhere near this. Let's just put it in the too difficult to handle and leave it for someone else to deal with. And I just don't think it's any interest for politicians suddenly to start talking about getting rid of the triple lock. And you saw that this week when Jeremy Hunt was before the Lord's Economic Affairs Committee, and he was asked quite an open question and just said, do you think that we'll be able to kind of keep paying the triple lock and keep the state pension age the same as it is for a long time? And he said, oh, well, we keep them under review and then we might not be able to do it if the economy doesn't grow and we don't make significant enough public sector cuts. And that immediately started a massive backlash. I think he was just answering it and just casually talking about it without realizing that when you're
the exchequer
and you say anything on this front, you're likely to make headlines on front pages.
Yeah, and of course last week he was busy saying that £100,000 a year salary isn't very much for some people. Now, Colin says, absolutely, you need to keep the triple lock. It's hard enough to live now. He's 70 and disabled. The other thing is worth bearing in mind before we move on to the next story is that when the pensions were introduced post-war and as part of the welfare state, we introduced at 60 for women and 65 for men, you weren't expected to live very long past that point. You weren't going to get past 70, right? So you're only going to get your pension for 5 or 10 years, probably. Now you get your pension for 30 years, 20, 30, and there's more money coming out of the system. And there isn't enough going in. We're going to have to face that at some point. Obviously, it's a big one for us to deal with in half an hour on here. I suspect is going to get discussed in probably the general election to some extent.
The other problem with the pension age is, I I mean, it's maybe all right for people who are doing office jobs, that they may be able to work longer. If you are doing something that's kind of much more practical, a manual job, you cannot work on a building site until you're, I mean, actually, you say that. I think my dad is still very practical despite being in his 70s. But you can't do the same day in, day out hard labor that you could do when you were in your 20s. And so I think there is a big difference between different people in different professions, that you just can't expect people to just keep working and working and working and working till you drop, basically.
No, but it is a bit dystopian as well, isn't it? The fact that also if you're poorer throughout your life, perhaps more like doing a manual job, you should work longer or work less and get less. And if you're richer during your life, you can keep on working and keep on being richer. It doesn't make much sense. Right, okay, thank you for that, John. I suspect this is the kind of thing which is going to get discussed an awful lot at some point in the future, as is our main story of the day. Well, it's not really the main story of the day, but I've decided to make it so, because this is going to be the issue which we're going to spend more and more time on in the next few months, as in the run-up to and the aftermath of the general election. So, which is the split in the Tory vote, okay, to reform UK. Now, this is the party that's led by, it's a post-Brexit party, if you like, which is led by Nigel Farage, although he is never to be seen anywhere near the press events for it. It's always Richard Tye, so it's one MP, Lee Anderson. There they both are. Absolute geniuses, the pair of them. Now, it's now reached double figures in the polls. It's at about 15%, which, considering the Tories are only on 22, is worryingly close. And the Tory idea is if they could somehow get rid of reform, they would have an extra 15 points in the polls and be nearer Keir Starmer. You'd be in hung parliament territory, right, as it's all to fight for. So this is causing more of a headache probably to Rishi Sunak even than Labour is. Now, our colleague Kevin Maguire has written today about how this is going to destroy the Conservative Party by splitting the vote so thoroughly, not that page, that's one, by splitting the vote so thoroughly there'll be nothing left of it. Do you think that's Nigel's intention, John? Does he want to destroy the Conservatives that he was once a member of?
I think there are some people in reform, people like Nigel Farage, people like Richard Tye, who would be very keen to destroy the Tory party and replace them as kind of the right-wing party in the UK. I think there are other people in reform, people like their recent new member, Lee Anderson, who I think would be less reluctant if that was the big aim for them. But clearly reform are doing quite well. As you said, they're now into double figures in quite a lot of polls. You see the odd one where they seem to be getting quite close to the Tory party. I think there was a YouGov poll last week where they were on maybe 15 points and the Tories were on 19 points. I think, though, in reality, as much as they are doing quite well, I think there is a limit to it. I think that the idea you're going to see them winning seats around the country just is not going to happen. I think it's possibly quite likely they don't win in any seats. They might possibly hold on to Ashfield, where Lee Anderson's the MP. But I doubt they're going to, I'd be very surprised if they got more than one or two seats. I just don't see it happening. But that can be very damaging to the Tories. A lot of seats around the country will just be decided by a few hundred votes or a few thousand votes. And if Reform managed to take a few thousand votes from the Tories in all seats around the country, then it is going to be really damaging for them. But I think we do have to have a bit of a reality check. It's, it is quite a while. It's not that long ago since I was covering UKIP in the 2015 election and following Nigel Farage around.
God, it feels a lifetime ago, John.
It feels a very long time ago.
8 years.
But they did well in that election. I think it was 4 million votes they got around the country, but they didn't get any seats. And as much as people talked in the run-up about how Nigel Farage was going to be the kingmaker in that election, actually, that's the election where David Cameron managed to get a majority. And it didn't actually stop him managing to stay on in Downing Street. He actually strengthened his position. And you look at the by-election results that we've had over the last few months, compared to those ones we had in that period around 2014, 2015, that was the time when UKIP was getting 20, 30% in by-elections, when it was winning in places like Clacton and Rochester and Stroud. That's when there was the Hayward and Middleton by-election in Greater Manchester, where UKIP came second. Can't remember the exact percentage they got, but it was something like they got 40% of the vote. They did really, really well. And you compare that to now, Reform is doing all right, but their best by-election so far was Wellingborough last month, where they got 13%. And so even though they have made great strides and they're doing quite well, they're still not on the UKIP scale of things. And so I think also when you get to a general election campaign and people are basically deciding who do they want in Downing Street, I think that if you don't have Nigel Farage come in to run the party full time, you stay with Richard Tice and Lee Anderson running the show, then I think it will be slightly limited how well they can do. Yeah, they might do well. They will still vote in the Tories. It'll be a nightmare for Rishi Sunak. But I just don't see them doing incredibly well.
I don't think even with Nigel Farage, maybe not going to get very far, because there was a poll out at the weekend, I think, showing about the net favourability and unfavourability of politicians. And Nigel Farage was exactly the same as Jeremy Corbyn, right, in terms of the proportion of people who liked him and the proportion of people who really didn't like him. And there was a third and two-thirds, basically. They're the same sort of Marmite politician, aren't they? Now, Mike says, does Reform actually want to ruin the Tory party, or are they more likely to pull the Tories further right in exchange for stepping aside in the Tory marginals? And this is one of the points, isn't it? If they are determined to destroy the Conservative Party, to be able to rebuild it in the next Parliament in more in their own fashion, if you like, less diversity, less woke, less centrist, one nation Conservative, a little bit more virulently anti-immigrant, anti-diversity, all these other things that they've got going on, anti-regulation. Are they doing that really as a pressure group, I suppose, to move the Conservatives more that way? Because as we all know, and I'm sure Nigel knows as well, like you say, when it gets to an election, people vote Tory or Labour. That's who they want to either be in Downing Street. No one wants Nigel in there, do they? Not twice, well, even once. But are they acting as a pressure group, or are they acting as a destructive force? Because they're having the effect of a pressure group to some extent, aren't they? But is that where it's going to go, do you think? Are they going to end up stepping aside perhaps in some constituencies if they get to a deal?
Yeah, so before they definitely have acted like a pressure group. If you go back to 2015, it was the pressure that UKIP was putting on the Tories that meant that David Cameron agreed to holding the Brexit referendum. And in 2019, which was obviously the Brexit election, the Tories did manage to convince Reform, or the Brexit Party as it was then, not to stand in seats that had a Tory MP, had a sitting Tory MP. They weren't going to challenge existing Tory MPs, which was a massive deal for the Tories. It was really helpful for them. It really did boost their standing in those seats. And the reason they did that then was because people like Nigel Farage were worried that Brexit was in jeopardy. There was a chance that the Remainers would get a second referendum if Boris Johnson didn't manage to get a majority. This time around, there isn't the same argument, and there isn't. You listen to people like Richard Tice on the radio, on the TV, and they say they've got no interest in doing a deal at all, that they think just the Labour and the Tories are just the same. And I think that the Tories would love to do a deal with them. I just struggle to see what they'd be able to get a deal on. Maybe we'll see Lord Farage in the House of Lords and Lord Richard Tice and goodness knows what. But I think at the moment, because Brexit isn't a top issue at the moment, I just think that they will be reluctant to do anything to help the Tories. And there is a lot of bad blood there between the two parties. I think the one person who might be willing to do a deal, though, and this is Fantasyland politics, this is just a theory, I think the chance of it happening is still quite small, but I think it is a possibility, is Lee Anderson. You listened to him the other week when he defected from the Tories to Reform, and he sounded really reluctant. All the questions in the press conference, people trying to get him to slag off Rishi Sunak and the Tory party, he wasn't that keen to do it. He's still friends with loads of Tories in Parliament. You see him in bars with Parliament with Tory MPs since his defection. And if I was the Tory party, I would offer Lee whatever he wanted to get him back. I mean, he is a toxic force. We know that what he said is highly controversial. It doesn't go down well with loads of the electorate, and it's really inappropriate, many of the things he said. But you could imagine, I can just see a circumstance where you're in the run-up to the election campaign and suddenly, ta-da, they wheel out Lee Anderson. He's come back to the fold, and his message to Tory voters is, don't vote for reform. By doing that, you're letting Keir Starmer into number 10. Vote Tory. I dabbled with reform, but I've decided actually it's the best thing to do to vote Tory. Now, I think the chance of that happening is still, I'd say it's a minority chance, but I think there is still a chance there that maybe Rishi Sunak will decide there is a way back for Lee Anderson.
Yeah, well, it's not that unlikely, I'd have thought, because, judging from his past history, Lee Anderson's been a member of pretty much every party that's going. There's no reason to think that he wouldn't be. It's political roundabout, that man. He doesn't care where he is, as long as he's getting all the attention. Now, what do you think, everybody? Do you think Reform have got a good chance? Are you keen on thinking about voting for Reform in your particular constituency? Is it going to make a difference? Why are you doing it? Because a lot of it may be a protest vote. Paul says, believe when it comes to the actual vote, people won't go down the Reform route. Polls have previously been proven wrong. And things do change, as John said, when you get up into an election. But, if Reform does very well across the board, as John said, like UKIP did, they may not have enough in one place to return an MP. Elaine says the Tories are going to be toast for years, but they could still, Reform can still decimate all these Tory numbers. And then Keir would find himself facing a very right-wing, very niche, actually, rump that hasn't got broad appeal across the entire population, a bit like Labour under Jeremy Corbyn, perhaps. And they'll be looking at a very comfortable stroll to a second term. But the official opposition, and this is the thing, Elaine, we need to worry about, the official opposition would be so virulently right-wing that there are some Labour figures, it says in Kevin's piece, that are worrying that it will just pollute the political discourse for years, because they will be, that kind of view will become the official opposition. And then it gets this varnish of credibility and respect, and they demand and they get equal airtime with the government of the day. So if we have a very, very right-wing rump of a Conservative Party that's more influenced by Reform, you could well find that actually some of this stuff that we really hate thinking and hearing and talking about, kind of stuff that Lee Anderson has said, is going to be far more, almost appear to be mainstream, couldn't it, John? Do you think that Rishi's got any chance of heading this off? I mean, obviously his policy is going to be telling Reform voters that they're effectively voting for Keir Starmer, isn't he? Is that going to work?
I think it will work with some voters, and you always get the squeeze when you get into an election campaign. And you have things like the TV debates that will probably be Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer in most of them. I think that they probably won't agree to one of those super big debates when they're all the different characters and the Green Party and Nigel Farage and the Lib Dems and the SNP and Plaid Cymru. What was that debate? And there was literally just like a dozen people on the stage. But I think so they will try and squeeze that vote. But I think that there are a lot of people now on that side of the debate who aren't really convinced by Rishi Sunak, and they would prefer a Kemi Badenoch or a Suella Braverman type character. The problem for the Tories, though, is the more they move in that direction, the more you start losing voters on the other side who votes in the centre ground, who just think, I don't want to be part of this toxic brand. It is just too far for me. And I think that's particularly a problem in seats, those blue wall seats that the Lib Dems are targeting in places like Surrey, Berkshire, across the south of England. In those seats, those kind of Lee Anderson-y, Suella Braverman, toxic kind of comments and arguments don't really help voters at all. And so if you've got the Tory split targeting one set of voters and targeting another, that's quite difficult, especially in an election that's, as much as you can put leaflets through people's doors that are targeted, most content that people get will be on the national stage and things that politicians are saying in newspapers and on TV.
Exactly, on TV and on social media, and it's going to be that kind of stuff, and perhaps even the stuff that we see on social media, it will tap into what we want to hear, but it won't necessarily be true. It could be AI generated and who knows what. Someone on Twitter calling themselves Decentralise Everything, who's got the Palestinian flag in their name, may not be their real name, says, yes, Reform is pushing the Tories further to the right. It allows Labour to feel more comfortable going full fascism too. I bet that excites you. Can't say it does, actually. Thank you, Decentralise. Now, one thing that Kevin writes, this possible surge for reform, about how it might pollute politics. He likens it to the SDP Liberal Alliance in 1983, that probably only Kevin remembers, and political professors. But that split the Labour vote in 83. It was exactly the same, but kind of on the left of politics. But then afterwards, it disappeared without a trace. They had a couple of dozen MPs, but they just sunk within a single parliament because they were a protest vote. And once you'd made the protest, it was over. A bit like Brexit, a bit like UKIP, a bit like the Brexit Party. You know, without people, if people don't have something to protest, you know, unless Reform can find something new every 5 minutes to protest about, trans rights isn't going to generate enough votes, all that kind of stuff, diversity. Without something new, Reform is going to be toast, isn't it? I know I'm not quite clear what some of their policies are now, to be honest, apart from immigration, which most people think we've fixed and doesn't work the way they suggested anyway.
Yeah, I think that a lot of what happens to Reform next will depend, where does the Tory party go next? So if the Tories lose the election, I think it'd be highly dependent on who do they bring in as leader. Do they shift to the right, or do they kind of stay where they are or move more towards the centre ground? I still don't know why they changed their name. That I realised that they thought that Brexit was over, we're moving on, we're going to be a party about other things. I just think from a branding point of view, people knew what the Brexit Party was. Oh, yeah, that's Nigel Farage. Whereas Reform, you get Reform, is it Reclaim, and goodness knows what else, all these other political parties. I think for a lot of people, it is less clear. What are they about apart from Brexit? I'm not really sure they've set that out beyond immigration.
No, I mean, Anne there said that, you know, could Reform ever meet its promises that it's made? If you tell us the promises they've made, we'd love to hear about them. I think generally speaking, it's just the Conservative Party isn't conservative enough. And that's kind of about it. They're probably not going to be in a position to influence much in the next Parliament, however it goes. So what's the point of making promises? They're just there to split the vote, aren't they? Thank you for that, John. I'm sure we're going to be discussing more about what happens with Reform as things go on. So it's nice to have a little grounding in that before we get there. Now, we have managed to find some good news in the world. Here it is. Now, we all know that times are very hard. Belts have been drawn tighter than they've ever been before. Mortgages have rocketed. We're stuck with a low-wage economy without enough migrants in it to pay for the pension bills. But the Charities Aid Foundation has done a survey and found that nevertheless, even though the number of charity donors dropped last year, people gave more than ever to good causes, with £13.9 billion being donated to help others in need. That's a 9% jump on the year before. Astonishing, considering how broke everybody is. John, is this proof, do you think, that you can take the money, you can take the migrants, you can take the pensions away from us, but you'll never take our kindness to other people?
Yes, and this actually, the figures in this back up what people have said for a long time, is that people who are less affluent tend to be much more generous with their money. And that is shown in these statistics. It looks at different areas around the country and how much of their income did they give away. And some of the poorest areas in the country gave away the highest percentage of their income. I think people were most generous in Sheffield Hallam, where they gave away 3.2% of their household income. So yeah, basically backs up what many people have said for a long time, is that many people who are less affluent are actually a lot more generous than people who are rather wealthy.
Exactly. That's how people get wealthy, isn't it? They just hold on to the cash. That's how other people stay poor, is they just give it away to other people. That's how it works. Fundamentally, there you go. Quick lesson in capitalism for everybody. Thank you. Splatter, says John. Thank you for that, John. Thank you for explaining it all to us. Thank you, everyone, for taking part. We will see you all again on Wednesday for another edition of the News Agenda. Till then, stay safe and tatty bye.